In 2022, the guns fell silent in northern Ethiopia. By then, entire villages lay empty, and the death toll from the Tigray War had climbed into the hundreds of thousands. It was a ceasefire born not of trust, but of exhaustion. Now, in 2025, satellite images show armored columns edging toward the Eritrean-Ethiopian border. Both governments call it precaution, the same line the world heard in 2020, months before the bloodshed began. In this video, we'll examine the military buildup, diplomatic breakdown, Red Sea stakes, and potential triggers for a new war. And to understand why the danger is mounting again, we first need to look at what the ceasefire actually left behind. The war that never really ended. When the ceasefire was signed in late 2022, official statements promised healing and rebuilding. But in Tigray's towns and villages, the changes were hard to find. One badly shelled road could cut entire communities off from markets and aid routes. In some places, power lines still lay in twisted heaps where they had fallen years earlier, never rest strong. The war had not just destroyed infrastructure, it had dismantled the systems people depended on to feed their families, reach a clinic, or send children to school. Fields lay untended after repeated planting seasons were lost. Livestock herds were decimated, and surviving farmers often found their land either mined, overgrown, or under the control of armed groups. Hunger bit deeper in the months after the guns fell silent. Aid convoys arrived sporadically, but routes were often blocked or delayed without explanation. Displacement remained extremely high after the truce, and in some districts it even grew. By April 2025, Shelter Cluster reporting documented around 760,000 internally displaced people still living in Tigray's displacement sites, many in overcrowded schools or makeshift shelters where disease spread easily. Humanitarian surveys continued to speak of staggering human loss. Estimates place casualties in the hundreds of thousands, commonly cited around 600,000, most of them civilians. A large share of these deaths came after the major fighting stopped, the result of disrupted food supplies, collapsed health services, and outbreaks in crowded camps. Rural clinics that had managed to operate during the war closed when medicines ran out. Malnutrition rates, particularly among children, rose sharply in some areas. In camp conditions marked by poor sanitation and scarce clean water, treatable diseases could move quickly and claim many lives before help arrived. The ceasefire itself left enormous problems unresolved. It sidestepped the issue of who controlled disputed territories, such as Western Tigray. Rival armed factions stayed in place, well-armed and unwilling to demobilize, while the political questions remained unanswered. Some militias rebranded as community defense forces, while retaining the same weapons and support networks as before. Eritrean troops formally withdrew, but their presence lingered through allied local groups stationed along key routes and strategic points. For many communities, life after the ceasefire was still shaped by militarization. Armed men were a daily sight in markets and on village roads. Curfews, sometimes unofficial, kept movement to a minimum after dark. Young men continued to disappear into the hills to join units training for a future fight. It was a tense, paused reality, conflict without the sound of war, yet still far from peace. Rebuilding proved nearly impossible on an empty foundation. Farmers lacked seeds, fertilizer, and tools. Prices for basic goods soared as inflation stripped away small reserves of savings. Desperate families sold jewelry, furniture, even corrugated roofing pulled from damaged houses, trading long-term security for short-term survival. As rural livelihoods collapsed, many people moved to already strained urban centers like Mekelle, driving rents higher and swelling the ranks of the unemployed. Much of the work available barely kept pace with the rising cost of bread and cooking oil. Humanitarian agencies worked under constant uncertainty. Access routes could be closed for security reasons with no notice or explanation. Local partners sometimes reported harassment or even detention. In highly contested areas, aid delivery required negotiations with more than one armed group, each demanding a cut of food or fuel before allowing trucks through. These delays meant some areas went months without organized distribution. The loss of schools deepened the crisis. In many rural areas, classrooms stood abandoned and buildings fell into disrepair. Teachers left for other regions or migrated abroad when their wages stopped, and children who had missed years of instruction during the war saw no clear path back. Schools had once been among the few communal spaces where children were safe. Without them, a stabilizing element of community life disappeared. The social fabric had also changed. suspicion lingered between different communities, and travel along certain routes carried risks that went well beyond geography. Checkpoints could shift from one faction to another in a single afternoon. Markets that once linked different ethnic groups were hollowed out or gone completely. In this atmosphere, even rumors of troop movements could prompt hundreds to leave their homes overnight, carrying what they could. Observers who had been in the region before the 2020 outbreak noticed disturbing similarities. Commitments written into agreements were quietly undone in practice. Patrols visited villages known for political dissent to conduct security sweeps. Some local leaders publicly spoke of reconciliation while privately securing backing from outside military patrons. The patterns were familiar, as if the ground was being prepared again. By 2024, Ethiopian federal forces had steadily expanded their footprint in parts of Tigray, explaining it as a mission to combat organized crime and restore order. At the same time, Eritrean military movements, still formally denied, were visible to those watching the border regions. Reports of convoys and equipment transfers made their way into diplomatic dispatches and humanitarian briefings. To many, it signaled that the ceasefire was seen as temporary, a holding pattern until conditions favored renewed action. Political dialogue, such as it was, stalled repeatedly. Meetings were delayed, relocated, or canceled over disagreements about details. The most fundamental questions, governance of contested territories, political representation for Tigray, the status of armed groups, were no closer to being settled. Without inclusive talks, power rested not in negotiation, but in the willingness to hold territory by force. Displacement kept reshaping the map. People returning to their villages were sometimes met by armed men claiming the land and ordering them to leave. Others described quiet but persistent pressure to settle permanently in urban areas, abandoning their farms. Fields turned to scrub, irrigation channels blocked or broken, and knowledge of cultivation risks fading where younger generations grew up in camps instead of on the land. These conditions hardened over time into a new norm, a fragile stability held together by the fact that neither side had yet acted on its grievances. But under the surface, the region remained a patchwork of militarized space, unresolved disputes, and people living with the constant pressure of scarcity. The ceasefire prevented open battle. It did not dismantle the machinery of war or bring real security. The official language from Addis Ababa and Mekelle still spoke of reconciliation, but on the ground the reality was visible. Armed presence where civil authority should be, shuttered schools, aid-dependent camps, and roads that led to checkpoints instead of markets. The situation was not sliding back into war in a single dramatic moment. It was eroding slowly, with each unresolved issue deepening the cracks. By the opening months of 2025, the signals were impossible to miss. New military positions appeared near contested zones. Flows of weapons to local groups were reported by multiple monitoring organizations. Civil administration withdrew from frontline districts, leaving them under the direct sway of armed factions. None of this marked the outbreak of fighting, but all of it suggested that the next spark would have little trouble finding fuel. From there, the fault lines ran outward, and one of the most visible ran along the contested frontier. Borderlines drawn in blood. Along the rugged terrain of the Ethiopia-Eritrea frontier, the space between nations has shifted from uneasy calm to a fortified, heavily monitored edge. What passed for stability in the months after 2022 has, by early 2025, been replaced with steady military buildup. Armored units from both sides now operate close enough to engage each other with heavy weapons, their movement sustained and deliberate rather than the stop-start rhythms of routine drills. Satellite imagery and on-the-ground observer reports point to forward fortifications, entrenched artillery positions, and concentrations of heavier equipment within striking distance of the boundary. These are hardened, maintained field positions, not temporary encampments. The scale and permanence suggest weeks of labor, consistent resupply, and a logistical network capable of supporting operations deep in remote districts. This footage and testimony also capture the obvious strategic intent, forces placed to reduce mobilization time to virtually nothing. In such an environment, one misread radar contact, an unauthorized crossing, or a burst of gunfire could trigger escalation before national leaders have the chance to intervene. The new positioning shortens the gap between incident and retaliation from hours to minutes. Both governments present their activities in nearly identical language, describing them as routine security measures or scheduled training cycles. The tone matches their public statements in late 2020 when major deployments were similarly downplayed. Those movements, too, preceded sustained offensives. Residents familiar with those years read today's official reassurances as warning signs rather than comfort. Border towns have adapted to the shifted reality. Civilian travel is increasingly curtailed. Road links that once supported cross-border commerce are sealed by military checkpoints, and once neutral market hubs have been replaced by patrol bases and observation posts. New dirt tracks carved parallel to the dividing line allow armored vehicles to redeploy quickly along the frontier, erasing the slower pace that might once have allowed a dispute to be defused before weapons were drawn. The layout of the terrain shapes how each side prepares. Ethiopia's approach to the south is more open, favoring mechanized maneuvers but leaving large units exposed to aerial spotting. Eritrea's side is more rugged, with elevation offering natural cover and vantage points for surveillance. Ethiopian formations keep to widely spaced positions, ready to converge rapidly if ordered. Eritrean artillery and defensive units occupy high ground where a smaller number of weapons can control a broad arc. In some of the most exposed stretches, local civilians are no longer present at all. Humanitarian staff reporting from the region describe villages emptied either voluntarily or under military instruction, creating uninhabited belts that extend the distance between populated areas and active forces. These cleared zones reduce the chance of civilian witnesses to small-scale probes or clashes and increase the buffer for targeting. The shifting patterns of trade also reflect the prolonged military posture. Border district markets now sell goods in the bulk packaging suited for military field kitchens. Fuel drums, vehicle parts, and construction tools are more common than household items. Remote strips of land have been cleared for use by light aircraft and helicopters, investments unnecessary for short-term exercises but crucial for sustained operation. Supply depots, often hastily built but guarded in long shifts, are located within haulage distance of frontline units, ensuring immediate resupply if operations begin. Reconnaissance is unrelenting. Locals in both countries describe drones overhead almost daily, ranging from small quadcopters to larger unmanned aircraft. Flight paths trace likely access routes, pass over suspected fortifications, and sometimes provoke anti-air activity. Each close approach carries the risk of misjudgment, the spark that could ignite a faster, wider exchange. Analysts note that the quiet buildup is politically useful. Admitting a full war posture might invite mediation or international scrutiny that could interfere with strategic objectives. By continuing to frame deployments as ordinary, both Addis Ababa and Asmara expand their capabilities with minimal outside pressure. The gradual pace of reinforcement draws less foreign attention than a sudden surge, even if the result is the same, a frontier where neither side is more than minutes from battle readiness. There's a psychological cost to the soldiers themselves. Prolonged exposure to live boundaries and visible enemies heightens stress and sharpens hair-trigger responses. History in this region shows that repeated low-level clashes often begin with such tense proximity. Exchanges between patrols that spiral once heavier weapons are just a signal away. Discipline can erode under the constant expectation of contact. From a strategic view, the massing of forward units compresses early warning intervals dangerously. Within the reach of Ethiopian positions lie critical Eritrean coastal assets, including the port city of Assab, just 60 to 70 kilometers from parts of Ethiopia's Afar region identified by Crisis Group as a likely staging ground. Conversely, Eritrean forces are well placed to threaten major Ethiopian transport links in Tigray and Afar. Both sides know the other's targets, and both have drawn up plans that rely on striking quickly if hostilities break out. This concentration is not only about deterrence, it is also about messaging. The visible presence of armor, heavy guns, and well-supplied infantry near the border signals to domestic audiences that national sovereignty is being defended. Governments in both capitals use these visuals to reinforce narratives about looming threats and the need for readiness. As these signals are mirrored back across the divide, they are interpreted less as defensive posture and more as signs of offensive intent. Mid-level indicators all point in one direction: defensive lines that double as springboards for attack, constant aerial and ground surveillance, and infrastructure geared towards sustained engagement. The official language remains calm, even routine, but the physical changes to the border landscape point toward confrontation rather than long-term peacekeeping. What makes the situation more precarious is the absence of any real diplomatic bridge between the two capitals. Without serious dialogue, forward deployments are not balanced by lines of communication that could cool a flashpoint. Instead, each new movement or installation becomes one more weight on a scale already tipped toward conflict. Those watching closely understand that the military geography of the border in 2025 is the product of unresolved grievances, cautious probing, and calculated positioning. But the geography is only part of the story. Behind the walls of sandbags and the arcs of patrols lies a political shift that has brought former partners to the edge of direct confrontation, from allies to adversaries. In 2020, Addis Ababa and Asmara were on the same side of the battlefield. Their forces launched coordinated attacks into Tigray, exchanged intelligence, and divided operational zones. Eritrean troops pushed south through border towns while Ethiopian federal units advanced north from the heartland. The alliance was born of expediency, a shared determination to break the TPLF's political and military hold, and for a time, joint objectives outweighed underlying mistrust. The need for constant coordination kept the partnership functional, even if each side harbored doubts about the other's long-term intentions. That fragile alignment began to loosen after the Pretoria Agreement ended major hostilities in late 2022. The accord, negotiated between Ethiopia's federal government and Tigray's leadership with mediation from outside powers, did not include Eritrea as a signatory. Analysts point to this omission as a decisive turning point. By leaving Asmara out of a settlement that would reshape Tigray's political order, Ethiopian leaders signaled they were prepared to outline a post-war arrangement without Eritrean consent. Asmara read the exclusion as a deliberate move to limit its influence, while in Addis Ababa, the calculation was that including Eritrea risked prolonging negotiations and complicating the deal. The result was a peace framework that addressed one war, but planted the seeds of another rivalry. In the months following Pretoria, frictions emerged in ways that escaped much public notice. Eritrean officers reportedly complained of being frozen out of regional security consultations. Ethiopian officials were accused of dismantling remnants of Eritrea's wartime networks inside Tigray, particularly local militias that had maintained contact with Asmara. These measures fell short of open confrontation, but they marked a shift from necessity-driven cooperation to quiet competition for influence. By mid-2023, the rivalry had moved beyond policy positioning. Ethiopian agencies were reported to be extending discreet support to Eritrean opposition groups, particularly small coastal factions that had been dormant for years. Suddenly, these groups had funding for secure communications, access to training sites, and the means to travel abroad, changes Eritrean intelligence linked to Ethiopian sponsorship. Across the border, Ethiopia's internal security services accused Eritrea of supplying arms and other aid to armed groups in Ethiopia's Amhara region, where unrest frequently pulls federal forces away from the north. These alleged transfers, including foreign-supplied drones and other equipment, were denied by Asmara, but patterns in supply chains and the timing of flare UPS kept the accusations in circulation. Such moves drew the contest into the lives of border-adjacent communities. Influential local leaders found themselves courted by both capitals. Material incentives from vehicles and fuel to cash and promises of safe passage came with the expectation of loyalty. For farmers, traders, or elders in these zones, refusing either side risked suspicion, cutting into access to markets or healthcare. The narrow space for neutrality shrank further each month. Diplomatic contact deteriorated in parallel. Joint appearances and statements became rare. International mediators struggled to bring delegations from both countries into the same room, even for talks on technical matters like border maintenance or coordinated patrols. When such meetings did take place, they avoided broader strategic questions, leaving mutual suspicions unchecked. In Addis Ababa, policymakers concluded that Asmara would act to destabilize Ethiopia if it saw an opening. In Eritrea, Ethiopian military strengthening, especially its partnerships for arms and drone procurement with foreign states, was read as preparation for a direct challenge. This breakdown filtered into interactions along the frontier. Ethiopian units began to restrict Eritrean access to shared water points and grazing lands. Eritrean border guards increased inspections of Ethiopian vehicles, bringing cross-border trade far below its pre-war volumes. While these actions fell short of military engagement, they added daily irritants to an already strained relationship. Inside Tigray, groups once cooperating with both armies were pushed to choose allegiances. Feeding, arming, or sheltering the wrong fighters invited retaliation. In practice, the tension between neighboring states made local security more volatile. Factions began stockpiling supplies, shifting to more defensible positions, and forging new alliances, effectively hardening Tigray into a zone of proxy competition. The shift from battlefield allies to rivals echoed beyond their shared border. During the Tigray War, the United Front deterred outside actors from probing too deeply. Now their hostility created vacuum and opportunity, inviting the involvement of other states with an interest in ports, transport corridors, or military access in the Horn of Africa. Regional powers found their offers of investment, arms, or diplomatic backing more welcome under these divided conditions than when Ethiopia and Eritrea still coordinated security policy. For analysts, the exclusion of Eritrea from Pretoria was not just a procedural oversight, it was a moment that clarified each side's view of the other. Without a binding framework to manage post-war security, the relationship reverted to pre-alliance patterns, guarded, suspicious, and willing to use indirect means to weaken the other. The absence of trust was now reinforced by the presence of active measures, reported Ethiopian backing for exiled Eritrean factions, alleged Eritrean arms pipelines to Ethiopian insurgents. For civilians in the affected regions, the consequences were both immediate and grinding. Aid distribution points now face parallel inspection systems, slowing the delivery of food or medicine. Border towns saw trade dwindle. Markets shrank, and goods moved irregularly, often at inflated prices when they did arrive. Communities already destabilized by the previous war's displacement were drawn deeper into a new cycle of coercion, where affiliation could determine access to even basic services. Security observers describe these proxy engagements as corrosive precisely because they normalize hostility. A small clash, a disrupted supply route, or a targeted raid feeds into a series of grudges that grow harder to reverse. Military planners on both sides fold these incidents into broader threat assessments, justifying further reinforcement along the frontier. Neither side seems prepared to spend its political capital onto escalation when leverage can be gained through persistence. For Ethiopia's leadership, the standoff imposes a complex balancing act between confronting external pressure from the north and containing multiple insurgencies across its regions. For Eritrea, sustaining operations aimed at Ethiopia while guarding its limited coastline and managing internal affairs strains a far smaller state apparatus. Yet both capitals remain willing to shoulder these burdens if they weaken the other's strategic position. What has emerged is a rivalry with origins in alliance. The shared enemy that once kept channels open is gone, and the mistrust that alliance temporarily suppressed has reasserted itself. Pretoria may not have created the break, but in shutting Eritrea out, it accelerated it, leaving two neighbors to test each other through proxies, economic pressure, and forward deployments. The result is a political climate in which direct confrontation is no longer unthinkable, only a matter of timing and opportunity. And as each side measures the other's intentions through these adversarial moves, strategic ambitions further south along the frontier, ambitions tied to geography, ports, and the sea, are becoming impossible to ignore. The Red Sea prize. For Ethiopia's leadership, the fact of being landlocked is more than an economic constraint, is a strategic vulnerability that shapes much of its foreign and security policy. Since Eritrea's independence in 1993, Ethiopia has relied on access through its neighbors' ports to trade with the wider world. Today, nearly all of its maritime commerce runs through Djibouti. Ethiopian planners have long viewed this dependency as a critical risk. A single diplomatic rupture, blockade, or regional crisis could disrupt the flow of imports and exports that feed the country's economy and industry. Against this backdrop, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's repeated statements about restoring sea access do more than appeal to national pride. They outline an enduring strategic objective to establish a secure and direct route to the Red Sea that does not depend on the cooperation of other states. In these scenarios, one port appears repeatedly in policy and military discussions, Assab. This Eritrean facility sits roughly 60 to 70 kilometers from Ethiopia's border, and on the map, links far more directly to Ethiopia's central transport spine than the route through Djibouti. During the Tigray War, Ethiopian forces made limited use of Assab under wartime arrangements with Eritrea. That presence gave Ethiopian military staff a close look at its docks, access roads, and supporting infrastructure. Such knowledge, from the quality of road surfaces to the location of nearby airstrips, is not incidental. It feeds into planning documents in which retaining the option of a short, controlled link to the Red Sea is considered a potential objective in the event of a wider confrontation. Pursuing that objective, however, is politically fraught. For the government in Asmara, Assab is more than a point on the coast. It is bound up with the sovereignty won after a long conflict with Ethiopia. Control of the port carries symbolic value that reinforces the legitimacy of the state and the authority of its leadership. From this perspective, even a hint of Ethiopian interest can be read as a provocation demanding a defensive response. In that light, forward Ethiopian deployments in the Afar region, whether intended as training or contingency readiness, take on added significance. Analysts note that while no public plans exist for moving on Assab, the port's proximity makes it an obvious entry in the catalog of targets that could tempt a limited operation if relations collapse. The appeal for Ethiopia is not only geographic, but also tied to the Red Sea's growing global importance. This narrow sea connects the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean and handles a significant share of the world's maritime trade through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Controlling or influencing a port along its shoreline would give Ethiopia greater economic autonomy, bolstering resilience against external pressure. It would also increase its leverage in regional diplomacy, where access to maritime routes can function as a bargaining chip in security and economic negotiations. In times of crisis, the ability to ship goods directly without relying on intermediaries can translate into both strategic and economic survival. Adding to the complexity is the role of outside powers, particularly the United Arab Emirates. Over the past decade, the UAE has expanded its political, economic, and military presence along the Red Sea corridor, investing in ports, airfields, and logistical hubs. Assab has been part of this network, fitted out to support UAE operations connected to conflicts in Yemen, and refitted to handle both military and commercial functions. While no direct arrangements between Abu Dhabi and Ethiopia have been reported in this regard, the UAE's expanding footprint in the Red Sea creates overlapping interests that could influence how any move on Assab is viewed internationally. Anything that changes control of the port could affect Emirati investments or operational access, complicating the calculus for all parties. For Ethiopia's planners, the short overland distance to Assab makes it a deceptively attainable option in purely military terms. The approaches are passable, and the terrain does not present the kind of barriers found in other coastal campaigns. That proximity is why the port appears in hypothetical conflict scenarios. Its capture would not require a long campaign to reach the sea. But the absence of physical hurdles does not remove the strategic dangers. Moving against Assab would all but guarantee an armed Eritrean response. It would pull both sides into a fight that, given the Red Sea's prominence in global trade, would attract rapid political and possibly material involvement from external powers. The risk is not just escalation between neighbors, but a conflict taking on regional or even international dimensions. For Eritrea, defending Assab is a matter of state preservation. Losing it would be a strategic blow, and in domestic political terms could undermine the government's narrative of guarding national sovereignty hard-won through the independence struggle. That is why any action perceived as threatening the port's status could trigger mobilization well before a shot is fired. For Ethiopia, even a limited operation would be a gamble. Success might ease long-standing vulnerabilities, but failure could isolate the country diplomatically, drain its armed forces, and invite strikes on its own infrastructure. The potential knock-on effects would carry far beyond the immediate battle space. Djibouti might reassess its security partnerships, worried about being bypassed or drawn into a larger conflict. Other Horn of Africa states could be forced to navigate new alignments depending on how the fighting evolved. Yemen and Sudan, already affected by instability on their own fronts, might see shifts in Red Sea security impact their economies and political balances. Further afield, shipping nations from Europe to East Asia could push for fast crisis resolution to protect the sea lanes their economies rely on. History offers examples of how quickly control of Red Sea ports can become part of wider geopolitical contests. Cold War rivalries played out along these shores, with superpowers courting governments that could host their fleets. In more recent years, Gulf states have blended commercial port development with security agreements, embedding themselves in the region's political fabric. A sudden change in who holds a facility like Assab would instantly alter the calculations of every actor with a stake in the corridor's stability. Ethiopia's leadership frames its public arguments for sea access in historical terms, pointing to periods before 1993 when it was not cut off from the coast. Made in official speeches, these references are also meant for domestic consumption, reinforcing the idea of reclaiming what was once available. Yet in regional policy and security circles, such statements are understood as signals of intent. Eritrea, for its part, interprets them as coded challenges. Without concrete agreements or shared-use negotiations, the question of Assab remains suspended in a state where the main tools for resolution are military rather than diplomatic. The absence of any substantive dialogue between Addis Ababa and Asmara on the issue leaves analysts to model scenarios in which Ethiopia seeks to secure its own coastal outlet while Eritrea strives to delay or repel such an advance long enough for external intervention. In most variations, the risk is not that either side lacks the means to fight quickly over Assab, but that doing so ignites a chain reaction of involvement from regional militaries, outside powers, and commercial stakeholders alarmed by any instability along a major trade artery. The UAE's position adds another variable with no predictable value in either direction. If Abu Dhabi judged Ethiopian control of Assab compatible with its broader network, it might be inclined to accept it. If it saw such a change as undercutting its relationship with Eritrea or destabilizing its Red Sea plans, it could use diplomatic or economic channels to restrain it. That uncertainty alone is enough to give more cautious strategists in both Ethiopian and Eritrean circles pause. What emerges from this mix is a problem that cannot be reduced to maps, distances, or military readiness. The Assab question sits at the intersection of Ethiopia's drive for strategic security, Eritrea's need to defend sovereignty, and an increasingly crowded Red Sea arena where local actions trigger far-reaching consequences. In such a setting, even preliminary moves carry the risk of escalation. And just inland from a contested coastline lies territory where influence is already contested, a broken landscape of armed groups, unresolved grievances, and rival administrations, where any spark along the border can ignite conflicts further in. Tigray, a shattered chessboard. In theory, the 2022 ceasefire created space for Tigray to recover. In reality, it left behind a fractured region where power is split and authority is contested. The federal appointment of Getachew Reda to lead the interim administration reintroduced one center of governance in Mekelle, but it did not replace the other, the TPLF leadership under Debretsion Gebremichael and commanders loyal to him. The result is two entrenched administrations, each claiming to speak for Tigray's population, each with its own chain of command, territory, and armed forces that were never disbanded. Estimates suggest up to around 200,000 fighters remained under arms after Pretoria, giving both camps the means to enforce their claims. On the ground, the division is visible in where security authority begins and ends. In areas run by the interim administration, checkpoints and police fall under its political apparatus. In zones held by Debretsion-aligned TPLF forces, the same functions are carried out by units answerable to the party's commanders rather than to Addis Ababa. Movement between their territories comes under inspection, with travelers often questioned about political loyalties. This dual authority ensures even basic governance, running schools, allowing markets, coordinating aid, becomes subject to clearances from whichever faction controls a location. Strategically, it leaves a ready-made battlefield within Tigray and openings for outside sponsorship from powers seeking influence. The fighters themselves are not symbolic. They have combat experience against both Ethiopian federal troops and Eritrean forces, and they retain serviceable weapons from the war years. Access to new arms through porous borders with Eritrea or Sudan adds to the stockpiles. Neither Ethiopia nor Eritrea has shown interest in attempting large-scale disarmament, preferring to watch the balance of forces evolve. The presence of armed, organized men across the region means disagreements can quickly escalate from political disputes to firefights. For communities caught between rival authorities, control is unstable. A village under interim administration influence 1 month might see patrols from Debretsion's forces the next, often after short but sharp clashes. In rural areas, such incidents are reported frequently, rarely on the scale of the 2020 to 2022 battles, but enough to force civilians to leave uncertain territory for towns or displacement camps. Geography works against unification. Tigray's mountains and plateaus make it possible for factions to entrench themselves with limited interference, controlling access through mountain passes or key road junctions. Each side can secure its own supply network while obstructing rival movements. A campaign to reclaim the whole region would be costly, prolonged, and politically risky, one reason both sides hold their ground rather than attempting decisive offensives. By early 2025, these rivalries began to spill past Tigray's borders into the Afar region. What began as friction over grazing rights and water points between Afari communities quickly gained a military dimension, with each Tigrayan faction backing allied Afar groups. A local land dispute became an indirect continuation of Tigray's internal contest, fought beyond the region's administrative boundary. Despite its scale, the fighting in Afar attracted attention at the highest levels. Addis Ababa saw the presence of armed Tigrayan units outside their home territory as proof of unresolved autonomy issues. In Asmara, the proximity of skirmishes to Eritrea's own border highlighted the risk that instability in Tigray could draw in its border districts. Multiple analyses warn that Tigray's split makes an ideal proxy arena. If open conflict erupted between Ethiopia and Eritrea, each could cultivate its preferred Tigrayan partner, offering arms, funding, or political recognition to undermine the other. Proxy sponsorship would turn today's low-intensity confrontations into larger, sustained hostilities fought in territory neither capital can afford to ignore. Tigray's strategic location ensures that neither Addis Ababa nor Asmara can simply leave it to its own devices. Its roads, towns, and high ground form the main approaches for any military advance between Ethiopia and Eritrea. In 2020, this was factored into coordinated offensives between the two. In 2025, with no coordination and two competing local administrations, the same geography could support rival external alliances and campaigns. Under these conditions, reconstruction barely gets off the ground. Even when funding is available, projects risk being destroyed, seized, or rendered unusable if control shifts. Aid agencies must choose between authorities when delivering relief, knowing that working in one's territory can lead to exclusion from the others. Distribution ends up dictated more by political access than by actual need, leaving some communities well supplied and others overlooked. The governance vacuum has a regional security dimension. Armed groups know they can cross in and out of Tigray for refuge or resupply. Smaller bands from both the interim administration's forces and from the TPLF have reportedly sought work as fighters in other conflicts, taking their experience and grievances into places like Sudan's ongoing war. Such movements carry destabilizing potential far beyond Tigray's boundaries. Economically, the instability erodes livelihoods. Farmers delay planting for fear of raids. Traders reroute shipments to avoid confiscation at checkpoints. For many young men, joining an armed faction remains one of the few ways to secure an income or a steady food supply. Civilian administrative structures were severely weakened during the war and have yet to reconstitute the capacity to counter these patterns. Security, politics, and daily survival stay bound together. Publicly, both Ethiopian and Eritrean leaders voice concern about Tigray's instability. In practice, both monitor the situation less to promote reconciliation and more to spot opportunities. Each side seizes on local flare-ups as evidence of the other's interference. Such framing hardens positions and makes genuine mediation remote. The enduring split becomes useful, a tool for influence and a pretext for involvement. This feedback loop sustains itself. Rival factions remain strong because outside interest provides just enough support for them to endure. Outside interest remains because the rivalry offers leverage in a bigger strategic contest. With no serious incentive for unity, factions keep fighting at a low level, preventing centralized authority from emerging. In effect, instability becomes the default state and a strategic buffer for the powers surrounding it. The political cost to civilians is considerable. Without unified leadership, Tigray's representation in federal matters is fragmented. Competing leaders operate with narrow priorities, securing resources for their own territories while excluding rivals. Communities excluded from aid or investment accumulate grievances that feed back into the cycle of contestation. Over time, this shapes expectations. Young people raised in rival-controlled areas know only life under checkpoints and competing administrations. The notion of a single, secure governing authority is abstract. With power split between two entrenched forces tied to external actors, internal consensus loses ground to external events as the likely drivers of change. The greatest short-term concern is that regional tensions tip this balance toward large-scale violence. As Afar showed, even an ostensibly local dispute can change shape if heavily armed neighbors and their backers take an interest. A shipment of weapons, an isolated engagement, or an abrupt factional move could shift the local equilibrium, prompting one or both outside powers to act more openly. To both Addis Ababa and Asmara, Tigray is neither ally nor outright enemy. Its location and fractured state make it both vulnerable and valuable, a place where controlling key ridges and transport corridors could decide the course of any campaign in the north. That military relevance ensures it will factor into broader strategic calculations, however events elsewhere unfold. And as divisions in Tigray persist, the political messages from the capitals around it are adjusting in ways that sharpen the confrontation still further, narrowing the room left to step back. The rhetoric tightens the noose. By 2025, the tone from both Addis Ababa and Asmara had hardened into something that no longer resembled routine political discourse. Public addresses that once centered on development milestones or regional cooperation now revolve around defining the other as a direct and enduring threat. The shift is clear in word choice, the cadence of delivery, and the prominence of military imagery. National broadcasts lead with footage of soldiers drilling, columns of armored vehicles, or flags planted in contested areas, turning each speech into a visual statement of readiness. These images work hand in hand with the underlying message: survival depends on confronting the other side. In Addis Ababa, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has repeatedly framed access to the sea as critical to Ethiopia's very existence, placing current tensions in a continuum of historic struggles. His speeches fold maritime access, security strategy, and national destiny into one narrative, presenting compromise as a surrender of sovereignty. Past conflicts are invoked as lessons in resilience, reinforcing the idea that Ethiopia has always faced external threat and must remain on guard. The tone leaves little room for negotiation without appearing to betray that trust in vigilance. Asmara's rhetoric mirrors this intensity. President Isaias Afwerki's public statements and state media editorials warn that Ethiopia's actions pose a direct danger to Eritrean independence. They argue that even modest reductions in defenses could invite intrusion or loss of territory, and that Ethiopia's military movements must be seen as deliberate attempts to shift the balance. The line is consistent. Any sign of weakness risks undoing the sacrifices that secured sovereignty in the first place. Both governments have pushed these narratives far beyond cabinet rooms and press briefings. In border provinces, school lessons now highlight past grievances and military campaigns. Civic ceremonies open with parades and speeches celebrating armed resistance. The effect is to embed confrontation into public identity, especially for youth too young to recall periods of relative calm. In such an atmosphere, calls to de-escalate can sound like disloyalty, and leaders gain political capital by projecting defiance. This buildup in rhetoric follows a familiar pattern in the region's history. In the months before the Tigray War erupted in 2020, public language hardened in stages. Each side described the other as an emerging existential threat, and within weeks the first exchanges took place. Today, the rhythm is similar: more frequent speeches, saturation of media with security narratives, and political discourse narrowing to questions of identity, borders, and defense. The difference is that this time, the adversaries are former allies. The staging of speeches has also changed. Where formal addresses once unfolded in assembly halls, they are now delivered on military parade grounds or at forward bases. Television shots show leaders flanked by troops and equipment, with backdrops of armored vehicles, artillery, or coastal installations. For audiences at home and abroad, the visual signal is plain. Political words are inseparable from military capability. Each statement comes with the implied assurance that orders could be acted on immediately. Ethiopian state media pairs these speeches with features on dams, highways, and industrial zones, assets depicted as symbols of national resilience that must be defended. Eritrean outlets respond with segments on fortifications, mobilization drills, and coastal patrols. Neither side speaks publicly of launching an attack, but the framing prepares domestic audiences to accept the possibility if an incident occurs, offering a ready-made rationale for action. This language seeps into regional diplomacy. At summits or press briefings, Ethiopian statements on maritime access carry targeted undertones for Eritrean ears. Eritrean references to maintaining border integrity are understood as veiled warnings to Addis Ababa. Both speak past the diplomatic niceties. Their intended audiences are domestic as much as foreign. For leaders in both capitals, the political utility of this posture is significant. In Ethiopia, highlighting a looming external threat can unify diverse regions and distract from domestic unrest or economic strain. In Eritrea, sustaining a narrative of permanent readiness helps justify strict internal controls and the upkeep of a large standing army. The short-term gain is clear. Appearing unyielding plays well to constituencies conditioned to expect strength from their leaders. Public attitudes reflect the saturation of these themes. In Ethiopian towns near the frontier, conversation increasingly turns to speculation about preemptive strikes or the targets of potential attacks. In Eritrean ports and border settlements, residents swap information about readiness drills and watch the horizon for unusual movement. These day-to-day conversations are fueled not by direct contact with the other side, but by a constant flow of officially sanctioned messaging. Even humanitarian matters are reframed through this adversarial lens. Cross-border aid delays are described not as logistical breakdowns, but as deliberate obstruction. Checkpoint clashes are cataloged as proof of hostility rather than mishaps. This framing builds each minor event into a pattern of malice, reinforcing the view that the adversary's intentions cannot be trusted. The cost of such a climate is that it trims away the distance between a political warning and military action. When talks of existential danger and honorable resistance dominate the airwaves, any incident, no matter how small, can be held up as the proof needed to act. Populations already primed to expect aggression are more likely to support rapid escalation, and the political space for caution or measured responses all but disappears. Looking back at 2020, conciliatory gestures made late in the cycle were viewed suspiciously or dismissed as weakness. Once key actors were locked into the logic of confrontation, troop movements and combat followed with their own momentum. Now in 2025, the building blocks look comparable. Daily talk of imminent danger, leaders framed alongside military forces, and the notion that the current standoff is a defining test of national will. This convergence of words and preparations is what gives the moment its volatility. Every new fortification, relocation of heavy equipment, or redeployment of troops is echoed in the speeches. Every defiant turn of phrase is backed by a visible capability in the field. In this environment, stepping back is portrayed as both politically costly and strategically dangerous. Leaders who have promised vigilance cannot scale down without undermining their own image, and that dynamic makes an eventual clash harder to avoid. Observers warn of the self-reinforcing nature of this pathway. Nationalist rhetoric drives military readiness, which in turn justifies sharper rhetoric. Each capital insists its moves are defensive, yet the language they use casts the other not merely as a competitor, but as an immediate danger to survival. This is more than posturing. It lays the moral groundwork for aggressive action if a trigger emerges. In a region where a heated exchange of words has sometimes turned into fighting within days, the stakes are clear. Once leaders declare that action is necessary, the shift from speech to combat can be fast. The current trajectory suggests not only that such a shift is possible, but that much of the political and social preparation for it is already done. Any spark would find a receptive public and leadership position to act rather than step back. And while political messaging has its own momentum, it does not exist in isolation. The narratives taking shape in speeches and state media are reinforced by underlying pressures that leave few incentives to seek compromise, pressures that reach deep into the stability and resilience of each nation's internal systems. Economic pressure points. By early 2025, economic strain is shaping tactical and strategic choices in both Addis Ababa and Asmara. In Ethiopia, official reporting and international monitors describe very high inflation, a weakening currency, and declining foreign reserves. These pressures cut into purchasing power for households and make the cost of imported goods and fuel harder to sustain. For a country still recovering from years of civil war, economic shocks translate quickly into daily hardship. Ethiopia's dependence on imports for fuel, fertilizers, and certain staple foods means international price shifts work through the system at speed, raising costs in markets and squeezing budgets in both rural and urban areas. Estimates also put Ethiopia's annual port-related payments to Djibouti at around $1 billion or more, a sum that reinforces the government's view that secure, direct sea access is not just a strategic ambition, but a way to ease a structural vulnerability. Armed conflict within Ethiopia compounds these stresses. Fighting in Oromia continues to disrupt transport corridors with attacks on infrastructure and government facilities, while clashes in the Amhara region shift control over towns and trade routes. These insurgencies divert state resources from investment in reconstruction or services into prolonged security operations and counterinsurgency campaigns. The longer they persist, the more private investment is deterred, slowing broader economic recovery and leaving fewer financial buffers for the federal government. Currency controls and import restrictions introduced to conserve reserves have had mixed results. Limiting access to foreign exchange has slowed the outflow of dollars, but it has also made it harder for importers to pay overseas suppliers, delaying shipments and contributing to shortages. A growing share of foreign currency transactions now takes place through informal channels, narrowing the state's ability to regulate trade effectively. While officials characterize these measures as temporary, they remain in place, with no clear timeline for lifting them. Agriculture, still the backbone of rural incomes, is being hit from several directions. Insecurity in some areas has prevented planting entirely, while erratic rainfall has depressed yields elsewhere. Poor harvests reduce market supply, shrink household income, and push more people toward already strained urban centers in search of work. In cities, the influx drives up rents and housing demand, while public services stagnate or worsen. Rising unemployment and living costs combine to create an atmosphere of economic stagnation that feeds public frustration. Eritrea's economy faces a different scale of challenge, but with equally constraining effects. Long-standing isolation from the global financial system and a small industrial base keep its revenue sources narrow. The state relies heavily on diaspora remittances, income from limited mining activity, and a small set of strategic partnerships that carry political conditions. Among these are defense relationships, including reported transactions with Russia that bring military equipment but deepen dependency on partners that face their own constraints under international sanctions or shifting foreign policy priorities. This reliance limits Eritrea's ability to adjust if a partner falters. With few large-scale investors and minimal access to standard forms of international credit, the government turns to high-stakes agreements in mining, security services, or logistics that carry risks alongside their rewards. A setback in any one of these sectors, whether due to market changes, diplomatic shifts, or broader regional instability, leaves a gap that is difficult to fill quickly. In both countries, domestic economics intersect directly with the politics of security. Sustained internal crises erode public patience with slow reforms. Leaders working under these conditions may see political advantage in externalizing pressure, framing confrontation with a neighboring state as a unifying cause that blunts criticism of domestic shortcomings. In Ethiopia, the combination of high living costs, unresolved insurgencies, and slow post-war rebuilding creates an environment in which overt strength on the international stage can resonate more immediately than incremental economic management. In Eritrea, portraying itself as a small nation resisting persistent external threats has long been central to political legitimacy. Maintaining forward-deployed units, reinforcing defensive works, and acquiring new hardware all require funding, even short of open hostilities. In Ethiopia, the cost of drone acquisitions and troop deployments to contested regions competes with social spending. For Eritrea, sustaining a trained military force and paying for new arms packages, often involving hard currency or resource-linked arrangements, applies steady pressure to already limited reserves. Political. Decision-making in both capitals must account for these fiscal realities, but is also shaped by how leaders believe visible readiness influences domestic cohesion and Dieter's rivals. Economic strain does not make armed conflict a cost-free choice, but regional history shows that leaders under increasing internal pressure sometimes view external confrontation as politically useful. It can create a rallying effect, justify extraordinary measures, and distract from unpopular economic conditions. That logic is tactical rather than financial. The appeal lies in consolidating support at home, not in any expectation that war will solve structural problems. For Ethiopia, the challenge is to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of a population that has endured repeated crises without visible economic relief. Diplomatic wins or military posturing can be showcased quickly in a way that incremental changes in inflation or employment cannot. For Eritrea, demonstrating defiance and readiness against a much larger neighbor reinforces the image of a government safeguarding hard-won sovereignty. In both cases, the risk is that leaders may discount the long-term economic damage of conflict in favor of immediate political gain. That choice carries hazards for each of them. For Ethiopia, extended hostilities could depress already fragile revenues, disrupt access to Djibouti's port, or accelerate the departure of skilled labor. For Eritrea, fighting could threaten its limited coastal trade and unsettle the external partnerships it depends on. Both economies would be vulnerable to secondary effects, from sanctions to spikes in import costs, if the region's transport or energy flows were disrupted. The capacity of both states to operate under scarcity changes how those risks are weighed. Governments long accustomed to rationing, sanctions, and disrupted trade have built systems and public expectations that can absorb shocks that would destabilize more open economies. Populations already familiar with hardship may adapt to wartime economies more readily, allowing leaders to take risks that appear irrational from a purely economic perspective. In this setting, even small or temporary economic shifts can be reframed as gains. Eritrea might benefit briefly from higher domestic agricultural prices if imports fall. Ethiopia could see short-term job creation linked to mobilization. Such outcomes can be highlighted in official messaging as evidence of strength or adaptability, masking deeper structural damage for as long as the public accepts the framing. The potential for external support in wartime also factors into this calculus. Regional allies, global powers with strategic stakes in the Horn of Africa, and private actors could all choose to back one side materially if it serves their own interests. The expectation of such backing, in equipment, credit, or political cover, lowers the perceived economic barrier to military action. For both governments, these possibilities form part of contingency planning, even if no decision has been taken to escalate. Traditional deterrents to war, such as fear of economic collapse, exert less influence in this environment. Years of managing under constraints have made decision-makers more willing to tolerate disruption. That does not mean economic conditions drive them toward war, but it does mean the prospect of additional hardship is less likely to serve as a brake. What matters more is how leaders calculate the political return on taking action versus the risks of appearing passive in a period of high tension. With constrained economies, entrenched pressures, and leaderships confident they can frame defensive measures as national imperatives, the material aspect of war planning becomes easier to justify domestically. The question is no longer just what either side might lose in pure economic terms, but what they believe can be gained in political standing or strategic leverage by accepting those losses. And while these internal calculations remain within national capitals, the resources to sustain them or change their course often lie elsewhere, in the networks of states and actors whose own agendas are tied to the Horn of Africa's instability. The outside hands in the game. Foreign involvement in the Horn of Africa is often framed as a background factor, something that follows the outbreak of violence rather than shapes the path toward it. In the Ethiopian-Eritrean standoff, signs suggest the opposite. The region's proximity to one of the world's busiest shipping lanes gives local tensions immediate strategic relevance, making the border not just a national security issue for its two neighbors, but a point of interest for states with their own maritime, military, and political agendas. For those actors, instability provides an opening to secure footholds, strengthen alliances, or influence any eventual settlement to their advantage. Some of these relationships are long-standing. The United Arab Emirates has invested heavily along the Red Sea coast over the past decade, combining commercial port development with security cooperation. It has previously maintained a presence at Eritrea's port of Assab, which was upgraded to handle both civilian cargo and military logistics. Background reporting identifies the UAE as having security ties with Ethiopia as well, and such links signal a readiness to work with both sides when strategic priorities align. This dual engagement allows Abu Dhabi to hedge its interests while retaining leverage no matter how the border dynamic shifts. For Eritrea, one of the most consistent security partners in recent years has been Russia. That relationship has included military cooperation and diplomatic support, which Asmara values for its lack of political conditions tied to governance or internal reform. For Moscow, engaging Eritrea offers access to a partner position near a maritime choke point, as well as another way to expand influence in a region where Western involvement is often constrained. These security ties do not imply direct intervention, but they do represent potential channels for material assistance and political backing if tensions turn into open fighting. Other outside players take a more indirect approach. Turkey's footprint in the Horn includes trade, infrastructure projects, and prior military training programs in parts of East Africa. While there is no confirmed evidence of direct Turkish arms shipments to Ethiopia or Eritrea in this context, its past record of combining commercial engagement with selective security cooperation ensures Ankara is part of both governments' strategic calculations. Even without current transfers, the possibility of future involvement keeps relationships active. China's role is primarily economic, yet it carries strategic weight. Its investments in Horn of Africa ports, rail lines, and industrial parks aim to secure trade routes that pass through the Red Sea. Djibouti hosts China's first overseas military base, underscoring the connection between commercial flows and security guarantees. Publicly, Beijing maintains balanced ties with both Ethiopia and Eritrea, but prolonged conflict could tilt that balance if one side offers more favorable terms for Chinese projects or if instability threatens existing assets. Even in the absence of visible military support, the scale of Chinese investment makes it a stakeholder in how the region's tensions unfold. Geography amplifies the importance of these relationships. The Ethiopia-Eritrea border runs close to shipping lanes that carry a significant share of global trade. Control over ports along this coastline, or the ability to disrupt them, is valuable and potentially dangerous in ways that extend far beyond Africa. Military equipment, training, or financing provided from abroad doesn't just shift the local balance. It changes the risk thresholds in an area where any sustained disruption to maritime traffic would attract global attention. These external ties also shape the internal calculus of the states at the center of the dispute. If Ethiopia's leadership believes outside partners would replenish its weapons stocks or help sustain key military systems, the perceived cost of offensive action drops. If Eritrea estimates that its alliances will ensure a steady flow of equipment or spare parts despite sanctions or blockades, it can plan for longer engagements. Leaders assess not simply what they have in storage, but how quickly those stores could be replenished or reinforced from abroad. The experience of nearby conflicts offers warnings. In Sudan's recent war, external supply lines kept rival factions fighting well beyond the point where their internal resources might have forced negotiations. These outside flows were not limited to weapons. They included financing, fuel, intelligence support, and political cover. Once these networks are active, they tend to persist, sustaining a level of capability that outlasts formal ceasefires and often re-emerging in later phases of instability. Training is another long-range factor. Skills in drone operation, air defense, or logistics management acquired a broad stay with the personnel who receive them, even if alliances shift. Ethiopia has incorporated foreign training into its modernization efforts. Eritrea, despite a smaller resource base, can multiply the effect of its limited hardware by sending officers for specialized instruction. The impact of this training is less visible than an arms delivery, but it contributes directly to how effectively each side could fight. For mediators, these embedded capabilities and supply channels complicate efforts to stabilize the situation. It is not enough to secure commitments from the governments in Addis Ababa and Asmara. The positions of their external backers can influence whether those commitments hold. If a partner state sees opportunity in resumed fighting, perhaps to strengthen its own negotiating position elsewhere, it may quietly encourage a return to confrontation. Even without foreign troops on the ground, the infrastructure of support, equipment, training, credit, and investment means any war would take place in an internationalized environment. Ports and trade corridors in the Horn are tied into global markets and maritime networks, so disputes over them resonate far beyond the battlefield. UAE involvement, Russian cooperation, Turkish connections, and Chinese economic stakes all create pathways by which a bilateral war could spill into wider contests, whether through overt aid or through shifts in trade and investment. For civilians, wars with external sponsorship are often longer and more destructive. Outside assistance can bypass local shortages, keep supply chains open, and replace battlefield losses, allowing both sides to maintain or rebuild combat strength. Humanitarian consequences mount as fighting persists past the point where domestic resources would have forced a pause. In a region already coping with displacement, food insecurity, and disrupted services, those consequences would be severe. In the Ethiopian-Eritrean context, the contours of such a scenario are visible. Multiple external actors have built relationships, made investments, or established security links that tie local stability to their own interests. While their motives differ, maritime access, diplomatic leverage, economic returns, or strategic positioning, each has reasons to watch closely and, under certain conditions, to act. The result is a tension that is no longer solely a matter between two capitals, but part of a broader map of rivalries and alignments. If this trend continues, any new conflict will unfold in an environment more tightly linked to global politics than in past wars between the two states. The weapons, skills, and back-channel guarantees already in place lower some of the practical barriers to initiating or sustaining combat. Even limited clashes would be harder to contain, as partners move to protect their own stakes, directly or indirectly influencing the tempo, scope, and resolution of fighting. That interconnection makes it difficult to imagine a self-contained war. External relationships extend the reach of the battlefield, affect how long it can be fought, and draw in audiences far from the Horn. Decisions taken in foreign ministries thousands of kilometers away could alter troop movements or resource flows within days. For Ethiopia and Eritrea, that means the contest over their shared border is not just a question of local advantage, but part of a much larger competition, one in which the range of possible outcomes is influenced by interests they do not entirely control. And when multiple actors with divergent objectives are connected into an unstable frontline, the margin for error grows thinner. It is under those conditions that small incidents can carry far greater consequences than intended. Miscalculation, the shortest route to war. In security terms, the greatest danger in the current standoff is not that either side wakes up tomorrow and orders a deliberate offensive, is that they arrive there by accident. This is the risk military analysts describe as miscalculation, when a limited incident unfolds faster than leaders and diplomats can absorb, forcing choices that drive escalation. The Horn of Africa has seen this pathway before. In 1998, a disputed patch of borderland between Ethiopia and Eritrea saw a small clash turn into a full-scale war. In 2020, the Tigray conflict's opening blows began with a contested strike on a federal military base, sparking 2 years of destruction. In this region, where disputes already sit on a bedrock of mistrust, minor incidents often gain momentum rather than dissolve. The conditions now along the Ethiopia-Eritrea frontier make that hazard acute. Artillery batteries sit close enough to strike opposing positions and towns within minutes. Mechanized and infantry units operate forward of major bases, often in areas with only rough demarcations of the border. Patrol routes can depend on faded markings, damaged signposts, or local memory. In such an environment, a single vehicle crossing a track it has no right to be on can be read as deliberate intimidation. Similarly, an unmanned drone drifting off its intended course may be seen as a prelude to attack. The room for assuming a benign explanation is already small and shrinking. The speed built into the order of battle increases the risk. Both armies have deployed mobile air defense systems and radar units near the line of contact, with crews trained to react to perceived threats in seconds. That speed leaves little margin for verification. A misread blip on a scope could mean a civilian flight is mistaken for hostile air power. The moment a weapon is fired in such a scenario, the politics of de-escalation become much harder. Leaders know domestically they will be judged on resolve, and stepping back from a clash may appear weaker than doubling down. Local command structures add another layer. In both militaries, officers posted to these forward areas reflect not just tactical training, but political alignment. They operate in an atmosphere where vigilance is often equated with aggressiveness, and where ambiguous movements by the other side can be taken as evidence of intent to strike. That politicization blurs the line between military caution and provocation. It also means a frontline commander's split-second decision can carry far more political weight than their rank would suggest. Once initial fire is exchanged, the configuration of forces makes escalation by momentum likely. Infantry or patrol units under attack are only a short distance from supporting armor and artillery. Calls for reinforcement can see multiple formations engaged within the first hour, each drawn in to support comrades in contact. When that happens on both sides, the clash grows rapidly, sometimes beyond what either national leadership was prepared to authorize. Geography compounds this. Mountain passes and ridgelines here have high strategic value, so troop presence near them is continuous, and any movement is scrutinized and often met with immediate reaction. The proliferation of cheap reconnaissance drones has further compressed decision times. Dozens of small craft operate daily in the border zone, mapping fortifications and monitoring movement. Their noise and proximity can fuel suspicion among ground forces that targeting data is being gathered for imminent action. Shooting down such drones has become commonplace in other nearby conflicts, but here the political temperature around any loss is already high. How the first downing of a drone is interpreted as an isolated precaution or an opening gambit will matter as much as the act itself. Civilian activity near the frontier can also feed the cycle. Even with large parts of the borderlands depopulated by fortification building, small communities remain. Crimes, cross-border herding disputes, or rumors of infiltration in these places can travel through local and military channels fast, arriving in command posts stripped of context. Past experience in the Sahel and elsewhere shows how such reports can be treated as confirmed hostile acts, prompting retaliatory measures later justified as defensive necessity. Public information control makes calming such situations harder. In both countries, state media routinely presents the other side as the provocateur in waiting. When audiences have been primed to believe that any incident is calculated aggression, the space for political leaders to say otherwise narrows. Live-fire drills and military exercises close to the border further complicate interpretation. Reports of convoys, even in known training zones, can be viewed through a lens of heightened threat if political tensions are already high, and observers must decide on intent in real time with imperfect information. In theory, tight rules of engagement could act as a brake on this chain of escalation. In practice, both militaries operate under authorizations to take preemptive action against perceived threats. Perceived is the operative word. Without agreed to confliction tools such as direct communication channels between field commanders or third-party monitoring, subjective judgment dominates. In these conditions, the choice to act first can feel safer to a soldier than the choice to ask questions. Once blood is spilled, the barriers to disengagement climb higher. Casualties reinforce perceptions of the other side's hostility and reward pressing the fight over pulling back. Local officers, mindful of their superiors' expectations, are often reluctant to be seen yielding ground, especially when reputations and careers could suffer. Cultural emphasis on resolve in both states' political traditions makes such reluctance even more embedded. The density of armaments along parts of the frontier magnifies all these factors. Within reach of each other are not just small arms units, but artillery, tanks, and mobile missile systems. A minor clash could escalate in less than an hour to exchanges using heavy ordnance across a much wider section of the line. More units are dragged in, more areas are affected, and more constituencies have a stake in sustaining the fight. The political system in both capitals would then be reacting to a dynamic on the ground rather than directing it. Such a sequence could begin without any plan to start a war. It could be as arbitrary as a navigation error in morning fog, a misunderstood radio call, or an ambiguous thermal image. In regions with trust, these might pass with clarification. Here, they risk being read as deliberate provocations and acted upon instantly. The combination of readiness, political framing, and compressed space makes the situation fragile in a way that arm's-length observers often underestimate. Analysts from the Klingendahl Institute, Crisis Group, and other organizations underline that this is not an inevitability. They highlight a handful of short-term measures that reduce the margin for error, direct hotlines between operational commands to clarify incidents before they escalate, African Union or neutral third-party observers to verify events, and mutually agreed rules on military exercises near the frontier. While none of these break the underlying political deadlock, they can introduce moments for checking intent before weapons are used, moments that are otherwise absent from the current posture. The problem is that putting such mechanisms in place requires political will at the national level, where leaders may see even modest cooperation as signaling weakness. Without them, the frontier remains in a state where reflex, mistrust, and nationalist rhetoric mix with high readiness. Under those conditions, avoiding war is not just about what is planned, but about what is prevented in the seconds after the unexpected happens. And that matters because the forces massed along this border exist in a wider political landscape already crowded with disputes, ambitions, and unfinished conflicts. Whether by design or by accident, the ignition point here would not remain contained, and the consequences would be felt far beyond the immediate frontier. The Horn of Africa stands in a high-risk equilibrium shaped by Tigray's armed fragmentation, the lure of Red Sea access, forward military deployments, and the backing of outside patrons. Together, these factors create an environment where a single misstep could trigger a conflict far larger and more internationalized than past wars in the region. Analysts point to practical steps that could still avert escalation, from an African Union-led deconfliction effort to renewed engagement by Gulf and Chinese actors, and full implementation of the Pretoria Agreement. Which factor do you think will matter most, Assab, Tigray factionalism, or outside patrons?